focused on sustainability. You know your work has arrived when they're making a MOOC about an idea that you've been engaged with, but you really know your work has arrived when you're on an episode of The Brady Bunch. And I'm trying to remember who was in that spot in the show. I'm old enough that I should know, but I don't actually recall. Well, let me start by saying this is a little odd for me because in years past, I was actually involved with some of the early planning around this award and the concept of this award as someone who's been in the field for a long time. In years past, I've served as the discussant at times and looking at some of the past recipients, people like Michael Ross, Liz Alden Wiley, Ambassador Marie Jacobson, and John Barnett. It's really quite an honor to be up here. It's quite humbling, actually. And I'm really grateful to sponsoring organizations, and particularly to Mishkat Al-Moumin for the absolutely courageous work that she did as the first environment minister in post-Saddam Iraq. Environmental change is often thought of as a trigger for conflict. And I think we carry with us the idea that scarcity, one of the principal side effects of environmental change is scarcity, that scarcity begets grievances, and that grievances beget violence. And I think some of the work that we've done has tried to challenge that sort of simple equation and that sort of determinism. But there's no question that environmental change scares us. It heightens our sense of group difference. It can make us think about hunkering down rather than reaching out. And I think it tempts us to visualize a world of scarcity and of constraint rather than a world of opportunity and of transformation. So I want to read a quote from you from Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations. And if you know Ban Ki-moon, he's very understated and sort of quiet, and it's really striking the powerful rhetoric in this quote. Climate change is real, and it is accelerating in a dangerous manner. It not only exacerbates threats to international peace and security, it is a threat to international peace and security. Extreme weather events continue to grow more frequent and intense. An unholy brew that can create dangerous security vacuums. Mega crises may well become the new normal. An unholy brew. That is strong language indeed. Well, I would never be one to deny the potential for violence around environmental change. The human rights organization Global Witness has built a database on the assassinations of environmental activists in the last 10 years or more. And the number is quite large, and it rivals the number of journalists who have been killed around the world in the practice of journalism. And we know that's not a small number. But what we risk losing in these narratives about security and conflict is the possibility that we can embrace these challenges, that we can cooperate around them, that they bring people together, even people who may be not comfortable working together, who may be in conflict, who may be in a situation of fragility and at risk of conflict. And that they can lead us down a path not of violence, but ultimately a path of peace. And that's definitely been the spirit in which the work that Jeff and I have done, and our colleagues and our students, because it really is a much wider community than just the two of us, have done. And I think it's all of that that's being recognized here this afternoon. And so really what this is about trying to unearth possibilities that too often get buried in fear or in narrow interests or in some effort to preserve the status quo. So I think a little bit of brief historical context about how we got into this work, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas. And then Jeff is going to talk a little bit, I think, about how it's played in the wider world of policy and practice. We got started with this a long time ago, really in the early days of the post-Cold War era. And there were two important trends that were converging at that time that brought us to the point of conceiving the initial work here. The first was the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, which many of us now look back on as the high watermark for international environmental cooperation. And by the late 1990s, when the international community was planning a 10th anniversary summit meeting in Johannesburg, Rio plus 10, the bloom was really off the rose of international environmental cooperation, and it was becoming apparent to many that the idea of the welfare gains and sustainable development that went with global environmental cooperation were not strong enough to get governments to live up to the commitments they'd made in Rio and to ramp up the ambition of those commitments to the scale that the problem demanded. And so many environmental policymakers and activists started casting around for another framework that might give governments that sense of urgency. And environmental security as a concept was really born in that quest for agenda setting. The second thing that converged at that time was the end of the Cold War, which security institutions around the world did not see coming, and which really threw them into a sort of a crisis of relevance and of forward-looking and of planning. And so it was a time when many people who thought about conflict and security were in maybe a more fluid space, open to new ideas, and when there was a perception, which seems quite quaint and naive now, that we would realize a peace dividend with the end of the Cold War, that those massive resources that went into the preparation for war could be redeployed for more positive and affirmative social purposes. So the combination of this quest for urgency and the fluidity in the security space produced this idea of environmental security. And some of that new thinking began to push the notion of the environment as a coming security challenge and a major new source of international conflict in the new world that we were all feeling our way into. And in the run-up to the Rio+10 meeting, there were governments and activists who wanted environmental security to be the dominant framework for the dialogue at the meeting and for policy initiatives going forward. Well, that bothered me as a recently tenured young professor at the University of Maryland, who had done a lot of work on the north-south dimensions of international environmental cooperation. Because in my experience, when the North finds a security instance in the South would be well advised to duck for cover. And it just didn't strike me that that was going to be a strategically effective framework for global action. And in fact, we see developing countries routinely rejecting that framework. They fought too hard to throw off colonialism and have sovereignty over their natural resources to see it be framed simply as someone else's security agenda. It also bothered Jeff as the newly minted director of the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And we already had a long-standing relationship at that point. And so out of this really strategic concern that that frame was going to be divisive and problematic and unhelpful, the idea occurred to us, maybe we can stand this on its head. Maybe if the environment can be a trigger for conflict, maybe the environmental imperatives can be a trigger for peace. So we decided to write a book, you know, with the hubris of youth, I suppose, that would change the agenda for Rio+10. And of course, with books being what they are, the book came out, what, 3 years after Rio+10? We missed that mark. But maybe it's gotten a little traction since. We do have the MOOC, as some evidence of that, I guess. So at this point, I want to segue into a little bit of theory. And I have to be very careful here. I promised Carl I would not do theory. And Carl was right to extract that promise from me. The second year that I was teaching as a university professor, a student wrote on a course evaluation, if I had 20 minutes to live, I would like to spend it with Dr. Conca. Because Dr. Conca can make 20 minutes seem like 2 hours. Thank you. I've learned, I think. You be the judge, I think I've learned. But very briefly, 3 core premises behind the work. The first premise is that because environmental issues ignore human boundaries, they demand cooperation across those boundaries. Whether those boundaries are between nations, or clans, or identity groups, or neighborhoods, or the people who live upstream and upwind, and those who live down. And maybe that interdependence can be used to create cooperative incentives, even among actors who are not inclined to cooperate with each other, even among actors in situations of conflict or risk of conflict. The second premise, the environment can create in people a very deeply rooted sense of place. It can attach to their identity in very fundamental ways and be a core piece of that identity. That's a challenge for us with our fragmented cosmopolitan identities, but even we can feel that pull. Maybe that can be used to strengthen people's shared identities in a place, or at least to soften some of the more divisive and conflict-oriented identities that can also take root in specific places. And third, environmental problems are technically complex, and they challenge us to think forward into an uncertain world. Uncertainty is a very central piece of the problem. maybe that creates opportunities for social learning, for learning together, for wrestling together with uncertainty. And maybe that learning can be used under the right circumstances as a tool to build trust, again among parties who might not be inclined to trust each other. So with those ideas in tow, we brought together several colleagues, we did the book, and I definitely want to give a shout out to some of the people involved in that. I think people like Erica Weinthal, Stacy Vanderveer, Ashik Swain, Larry Swadek, who really have become, I think, significant intellectual figures in this space, and it was a real pleasure to be able to work with them. And we had them doing exploratory, case studies to investigate some of those propositions. We never said that environmental cooperation would lead to peace. Environmental cooperation sometimes only leads to more efficient resource plunder, and it's all about how it is done, and that's a critical part of this. We tried to assess whether particular types and forms of environmental cooperation might be used strategically to make peace, either by creating cooperative incentives, or by enhancing trust, or by reworking conflict-laden identities. The initial response we got when the book came out, way too late for Rio Plus 10, was, it's a very nice idea, where's the proof? Where's the empirical data? And that was a frustrating response to get, because our view was, well, if governments or NGOs or other actors in a position to try this will try it, we'd be happy to try to measure whether it's having any effectiveness or not, but you have to try it first. But I did take that to heart, and so one of the reasons why, as Clayton mentioned, I got very involved with working with UN Environment was I found them to be one of the few organizations that was engaged in practice at the time that was consistent with some of these ideas. One of the most important things I think the book did is that it spawned interest among some younger researchers in doing research, and I think we've learned a lot. And I'll just leave you with a few quick observations about some of the things I think we've learned in the couple of decades now since we began working on that. And then I'll turn it over to Jeff to make some observations about the world of policy and practice. I think the first observation is we have a large body of evidence now that this can, in fact, be done. There are refugee camps where scarcities of water or of firewood or of other livelihood resources trigger conflict, either within the camp or between the camp and the host community and the surrounding environs. But there are just as many where we see people developing creative, cooperative solutions and new solidarities in the process. We know that climate change and water scarcity can cause tensions and conflict between herders and farmers in the world's dry grassland regions. But we also see instances of creative adaptation under those same stresses. Farmers start to herd, herders start to farm, their children start to intermarry. Established practices and localized expertise begin to be exchanged, and new cooperative arrangements about access to resources can in fact be worked out. The reason why it sometimes trends towards conflict and sometimes with cooperation is grievances are not the only factor. They are part of the story, but they are not the whole story. Much depends on our capacity, creatively, to channel those grievances into productive channels rather than into destructive channels, and much depends on the ability of those fledgling cooperative initiatives to have the space and the time and the breathing room to flourish and not become overwhelmed by turbulent changes in the landscape. A second thing that I think we've learned is that much of what we know is not derived from the work of scholarly research. Much of it is derived from the world of practice. And there's a lot of really rich experimentation that's going on by local communities, by donors, by NGOs, by intergovernmental organizations like UN Environment. And that's very valuable, and we need to figure out how to study that and how to learn the message in that information. But it also is very challenging. It raises questions about selection bias. Are people only working in places where it's easiest to get traction? It raises questions about the quality of the data. It raises questions about long-term effects after the NGOs or the donors go away. It raises real questions about community ownership of these processes. And so the challenge is on us as scholars to figure out how to use this rich zone of experimentation, but also to understand it in a rigorous way and figure out its full range of complicated effects. A third thing I think we've learned is that there's not enough attention paid to the institutions that are tasked with implementing these initiatives. Just before Christmas, I had the opportunity to speak at the United Nations, which was an interesting experience. And I spoke before a group of about 20 ambassadors who are sort of a self-defined coalition trying to place the question of climate change on the agenda of the UN Security Council. This has been a very, very contentious question about whether it belongs on the agenda of the Security Council. And they invited me because I've been working on a project actually with a few of my students here at AU on the institutional capabilities of the Security Council and what would the Council actually do. And I'm struck that for all the political discussion about that high stakes question, there's been very, very little attention to what has the Council done in the past when it's been tasked with new challenges that stretch its mandate in new directions. How well does the Council manage information? How able is the Council to coordinate with other parts of the UN that are doing important work on the ground? So we need to pay more attention to institutions. Another example of that in a very different context, several years ago, Jeff and I and some colleagues were on the ground in a river basin in one of the poorest regions of the world. I'm not going to say where because I would like to get invited back to the United Nations. It was at a meeting, and there were 3 countries involved, and they had signed a very interesting cooperative accord around a shared river basin, around which they had real conflicts in a very dry part of the world. It so happened that I spoke the language of one of the 3 countries, and I was the only other person at this small meeting who spoke that language. So I would sit with the people from that delegation who didn't have a lot of English, the language of the meeting, and we'd talk at night about what was really going on and what they really thought and so on. And I asked the head of the delegation at one point, I said, you know, one of the things we're all wrestling with is managing land and managing water in an integrated fashion. And we know you can't manage land without managing water and vice versa, but it gets stovepiped. And what are you doing with that? What are you learning from that? What can we learn from your experiences in that? And he put his arm around my shoulder and he said, Ken, that's a lovely academic notion. But I have to tell you, when we ended the Civil War, we kept the water ministry, and we gave the land ministry to the rebels as a way to bring them into the governing coalition. We don't talk much. We have to study the institutions that are supposed to deliver on these programs, not just the conditions for the success of the program. And the last thing I would say is we have to keep in mind that peace is not always the goal. In the summer, my colleague Erica Dabelko and I sometimes take master's students to the Middle East, and we work with NGOs in Israel and Palestine on the ground that are trying to cooperate on water and build peace to the best of their ability across that very challenging conflict divide. The Palestinians we work with in the West Bank don't want to talk about peace. They want to talk about justice. They want to talk about dignity. In Flint, Michigan, when the taps started spewing toxic material, it was only a ruckus that led to the recognition of that problem. And those people weren't particularly interested in peace at that moment either. There's a lot of other examples around the world: mining, deforestation, land and water grabs, also parks, land preservation for the sake of climate change, flood resilience programs in cities where someone's going to be asked to move to make room for the river. People who are most directly involved in these conflicts often do not see peace as the principal challenge and the principal problem. And on the one hand, we know that violence can shred any possibility for attaining these other social goals. Peace, even in the most limited sense of forestalling violence, which is not a particularly good definition of peace, but even in that limited sense, it's a very good thing. It's essential to the realization of these other goals. But it's often not the goal of most of the people who are involved. And we scholars or practitioners who come bearing peace strategies without an emphasis on justice will be looked at skeptically, as we should. So thanks very much. It's quite an honor. I ran over my applause line, but not good. Jeff is going to say a word about policy practice.
Someone else's here. So Ken and I have known each other and worked with one another for 25 years. That's back in 1993. And so you would think that I would know to go first. It's a slow learner. So I too am humbled by this award and thank the sponsors, giving it to Ken and me, but as Ken said, really to a community, as this has been really a community effort and one that has many people carrying water, literally and figuratively. So I'm going to reflect a little bit on the policy and practice side, and Ken gave you some examples and some flavor. I'll try to use some other cases and examples. There are many of them, and so apologies if your favorite one is not mentioned, because there are many favorites. I have really had the privilege of sitting in the kind of in the middle, which is where we wanted to be. This Woodrow Wilson Center Environmental Change and Security Program, it was kind of by law non-partisan and non-advocacy, which kind of gives you some freedom in some ways. But it really was meant to be a connector, a matchmaker, to not direct where this field should go, but to reflect the diversity of the interesting ideas and then connect them, connect the researchers across issues: environment, poverty, development, health, environment, security, conflict, peace. To do that with the practitioners as well, and often some practitioners that didn't have safe space to do that. So in 1994, when we started this, in the Smithsonian Castle, it was fairly surreal to see the generals and the Sierra Club come together in the same room. They clearly, that was new to them, and it was new to us, but it's a vantage point that I hope to share a few insights, and certainly, the good, the bad, and ugly that comes from this, you can blame this perspective. But it really was, I think, in some ways, it wasn't a mistake or wasn't surprising that the Wilson Center was where we had these discussions. It led to the book, and Wilson Center Press and Johns Hopkins Press that published it. So a few stories to talk about how policy and practice are grappling with these environmental peacebuilding issues. So if you're walking into the room, in some ways, what are we up against? And I think many of you, since you are participants in this, probably have had some, if not all, of these questions quite skeptically, with eyebrow arched, asked of you. Ken previewed some of these challenges. Well, this environmental peacebuilding stuff, you're not going to solve the whole conflict, so why do it? So unless you solve the Indian-Pakistani fundamental dispute, well, then, what's the point, right? It's kind of just feel-good stuff. If you're not going to solve the underlying Israeli-Palestinian. And that was one that, for a variety of reasons, this endeavor has been often loaded up with fairly unrealistic expectations that other issues, areas aren't asked to do. And so it may seem kind of absurd on the face, but I can't tell you how many times we've heard that, particularly on the kind of practitioner world that wants to get things done, right? They want to solve this problem. So what are we going to give them? How do you know it works? Where's the evidence? As Ken said, that's one that in some ways it's kind of life serial. Try it, you might like it, and then we can study it and figure out what works. More basically, and maybe I should have started with this, when one says environment in front of then a dependent variable that is conflict, peace, security, for so many, they flash to, what do you flash to? Hugging trees and hugging pandas. And I can't tell you how many times, particularly the military audience has said, essentially, we're surprised you're not wearing burlap, right? So that is a real distance that one has to come even to have a conversation and understanding that these things really go together in ways that we've seen to explore. I don't mean to make fun of it, but it really is often the challenge for the practitioners is this is the starting point when you're trying to work across these different issue areas and such. We can only afford to pay attention to these issues once we're rich, peaceful, and democratic, right? And there's a real substantive critique about who cares about what kinds of natural environment when behind that. But it was often a way to kind of say, in a post-conflict setting, don't worry, we'll get to it when the time comes. And so David Jensen, who we saw in the video, somebody who's really been pushing and pushing and pushing in the practitioner world and making progress and having success, even if at times it's one step forward and two back. To illustrate that, it was UN Environment gets off the plane in both Kabul and Kinshasa, and where do the local handlers take them? They take him to the zoo, right? He's the environment guy, right? So this isn't about natural resources and livelihoods and like day-to-day survival that plays in issues of war and peace. This is about a conservation agenda. It's not to minimize or denigrate that conservation agenda, but it's not about putting these things together. So environment treated as a luxury item in a post-conflict setting, rather than critical to jumpstarting an agrarian economy, understanding if that water's safe, how do we protect from, how do we find ways to discover that Charles Taylor sold, well, whatever it was, Carl would know, 120% of total land area concessions for forestry, right? Unless you take a break and figure that out, it's going to be really hard for an librarian to move forward. And then finally, too small scale. If many of us are familiar, EcoPeace is here, the Friends of the Middle East, the EcoPeace, good water neighbors, right? Oh, it's nice, local, school to school, and maybe community to community. You can just hear the kind of paternalistic pat on the head. But these folks find ways to scale and go across and play a multi-level game. And so getting past that kind of dismissive notion, how do you bring this to scale? You're just kind of, it's a nice story, but let's get serious about this security stuff. So against that backdrop, the practitioners are working. And in some ways, even before our focus discussion, some actors that we don't necessarily think of first in the peace-building realm, really influential cases for me in understanding this as I kind of got into it right as the Cold War was ending and first starting to study this. And so you'll hear from Sherry Goodman and the Department of Defense. For me, this Arctic Military Environment Cooperation Program, those of you who focused the high north, essentially the Norwegians were worried about whether their salmon exports were going to be irradiated. But it was looking at threats of radioactive contamination, largely from Soviet and Russian subs. And the Americans, the Russians, the Norwegians, and later the UK, using scientific assessment to talk, to figure out who's in charge. How do we find ways as the Soviet Union breaks up? And yes, the environment mattered, but really there was a security end, there was a peace building end, or at least let's have some trust, find some patterns of interaction. And so Sherry and her office at the Department of Defense went on to use this method as a way to talk across militaries, to also bring environment ministry and security ministry folks in different countries together. So in that sense, the objectives really were build trust, confidence, hopefully security, peace, through environmental cooperation. Now, as Ken has pointed out, it's really, it's not a kumbaya moment in all these cases. Right? There are plenty of times where this has been challenging. He mentioned Johannesburg in 2002. I had the privilege and also the challenge of one of those kind of totally unrealistic sessions. You have 60 minutes and 8 speakers and 2 discussants, and you gotta have time for discussion, right? And everybody actually, I was a little rude, but everyone's kind of stuck to their 5 minutes. We had a big full room for discussion. Only one speaker got questions. I was a speaker from the Peace Park Foundations, the early years of transboundary cooperation that had lovely heads of state signing ceremonies, including Mandela, but really screwed the local folks. And there were a lot of people there who had very real issues about who was benefiting from bringing the walls down from the apartheid era, something that was really important to do. And there was a great logic of bringing down those fences. But nevertheless, it was done in those early days in ways that benefited outside elites, increased human-wildlife conflict and across borders, so kind of pushed the conflict down to local levels. And we've learned lessons from that, and we move forward. Ones that, again, Ken talked about working with students. That's one where with Todd Walters, who's here, International Peace Parks Expedition, AU alum, we have tried to do in the Balkans with Montenegro, Kosovo, and Albania, and find ways forward to do that with Ohio University, where I am now, and our partners in the region in ways that really are bottom up and sharing benefits on the local level and having those folks do it. Now, the Balkans is an important place to start for our partners in UN Environment. We're particularly their post-conflict, I don't know how many different names, but the post-conflict assessment, you're focusing on that peace-building period, where they, in some ways, took advantage, like AMEC, of the relative lack of controversy around objective scientific assessment in a post-conflict period. Where are the hotspots? Help tell us where to go, where not to go, assign some degree of responsibility, and help formulate a plan for response. And UN Environment did those in the early years, but over time they worked to build into those assessments, and this was even a little more subversive than we realized. Some kind of assessment of what role the natural resources environment may have played in the conflict, or funding the kind of beginning, middle, and end. And then started to help design and support environmental management institutions that might be part of building peace and moving forward. Now those seem fairly straightforward and insightful and practical. There were a lot of battles about doing that, many of them in the field, but even more back at headquarters, more back in New York, where countries have continued to assert their sovereign control of resources. So this is not a security issue, this is just economic. Again, here the paternalism pat on the head. The perceived threats that particularly it might come from saying, oh, you're not allowed to do that because it might cause conflict, as opposed to after the peace building. And then, of course, that persistent caricature that environment's less important than the security. So at the same time, those UN-focused efforts did have success, whereas before with those fundamental questions, prove to me these things are connected. Prove to me this isn't about hugging trees and hugging pandas. And eventually, through a lot of hard work, a lot of people, many of them here in the room, it became, okay, we get it, there are connections. But what do you want us to do? And back to Ken's point, which is, okay, you've written this book, great deductive argument, now how do we do it? What works, what doesn't? So it's a new set of challenges, not just at the UN, but bilaterals, and EU has picked this up. Putting these ideas to test in the field in a range of fora and new approaches, with Carl sitting here, blue helmets and the green to blue report and other fashions, and then of course the massive resource that the multi-volume, multi-case environmental peacebuilding reports are that were mentioned that Carl and many have put forward. In that sense, I would like to flag one of the dilemmas that kind of reflective of that UN story, but in so many others, which is kind of called what's in a name, so what you call it really matters. Part of that is, well, you can do peace building, but don't get into prevention, because then you might be telling us what to do in ways we're not comfortable with. A lot of political sensitivities there, certainly an enduring challenge for environmental peace building, but even more fundamentally, if stating what you are doing, trying to support peace through environment, natural resource management, if by giving it that name and making it explicit makes your job harder to achieve that objective, so how do you do it without putting that label explicitly, or when do you put that label explicitly? Now, that has led to some reactions that often are, can be troubling in some sense of we're about transparency. Well, maybe early on in the discussion, negotiation, it's a relatively small group of people. And maybe negotiating and discussing this out in public with press release, and now age of Twitter, that actually makes it harder to do. So in that sense, it is a challenge in what we call it, and if we make it explicit, it'll be assumed that, well, as we heard from folks in the Balkans, oh, the students are here for environmental peace building, so you think we're still at war. No, we didn't say that. Right? We want to help you. Right? So, well, but you're calling it conflict peace building. But in that sense of what we call it as a challenge, and then being willing to not publicize, not be out front, not necessarily make this as transparent and widely participation as possible as something that kind of ironically, it challenges us in terms of how we get to peace. So finally, moving forward, one more case of practitioners asking questions of researchers and scholars. In this case, for me, largely U.S. Agency for International Development, but many of you have had this with many of our partners in the field. How do we pursue, how do policymakers grapple with environmental peace building within a climate change context? When we did the book in the late 90s, early 2000s, climate change, I mean, obviously there was a discussion going on, but it was not an integrated discussion. It was seen as longer term, diffuse, lack of intentionality. It was just these were largely separate conversations. Now, boy, hasn't the script flipped. Starting 06, 07, climate change became the way into environment and security conversations, almost to the exclusion of a lot of other important things. So how do we do that? And when our colleague and friend Cynthia Brady at USAID, working in the Conflict Management Mitigation Office, says, listen, I've just been tasked with evaluating every climate change assistance program that comes out of aid and asking two questions. Is this going to create new conflict or play into existing conflicts? Or how can it be designed to be part of the solution? If this is in a fragile state or conflict-affected state, how can we do environmental peace building with this climate intervention? We need to have answers to those. Those are ones where, again, we kind of say, you guys haven't really seriously done climate adaptation or mitigation yet. Why don't you try it? And then we'll try to find ways to capture co-benefits, triple bottom line, whatever kind of business speak we need to use by making progress on adaptation and peace building and poverty alleviation at the same time. So these are the challenges before us. Some promising progress, obviously lots more to do. But we have tried to put these ideas out. We've tried to then support those, trying to work with them in practical ways. And again, we thank folks for recognition of those attempts.
Thank you so much. My name is Carl Brook. I direct international programs at the Environmental Law Institute. And before we open up for discussion, I would like to invite Sherry Goodman to share a few remarks. Sherry is a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and a senior advisor for international security at the Center for Climate and Security. During her illustrious career, Ms. Goodman has been at the forefront of initiatives exploring the complex relationships between national security, climate change, and energy security. She was, for example, the Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary of CNA, where she founded the CNA Military Advisory Board, which stimulated a lot of that activity around climate change and security in 2006 and 2007, and served as its executive director. She also served as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, essentially inventing the post under President Clinton. Ms. Goodman was also the CEO and President of the Ocean Leadership Consortium. Currently, she is a member of the Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board, the Atlantic Council, the Adrian Arsh Resilience Center, the Marshall Legacy Institute, and the Council on Foreign Relations and its Arctic Task Force. Ms. Goodman is a recipient of the DoD Medal for Distinguished Public Service, the National Defense Industrial Association's Gold Medal, and EPA's Climate Change Award, recognizing her contributions to climate security. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. My mother would have liked that introduction, but we're really here to recognize Ken and Jeff. And I also want to thank Paul and Nancy Ignatius for your support and your leadership in this field as well. So congrats to you, Ken and Jeff, for this Lifetime Achievement Award in Environmental Peace Building. You're almost on the way to the Environmental Oscars, just in time to rent your tux. Okay. But seriously, to change how governments and societies undertake peace building can take a lifetime of achievement. I first met Jeff when the Wilson Center was still in the Smithsonian Castle, and Warren Christopher was Secretary of State. And I met Ken around the same time, and this was really in the early days. I was the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, appointed in 1993. President Clinton. And we were, and first of all, most people at that time did not know what environmental security meant. In fact, we probably didn't know what it meant either. We were making it up as we went along because there was no theory yet to go along with the practice. And many of my colleagues, many of the generals and admirals and other senior defense leaders that I worked with at the time said, now what's that environmental security stuff? We know you have to clean up those military bases that are Superfund sites, but beyond that, you know, this other kind of international stuff, not so sure yet. So we were trying to forge a new consensus around environmental security cooperation in the early post-Cold War years. And one of my missions as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense was to integrate environmental considerations into defense strategy, policy, and planning. And that meant building environmental cooperation among militaries around the world as a means to advancing American national interests in democracy, trust, and the rule of law. Yes, we were living in a different era. In the environmental realm, we were using environmental cooperation among militaries, foreign ministries, citizens, and businesses to both address lingering challenges, such as cleaning up Cold War era contamination from military sites, or to forge new support for cooperation on natural resource issues, from water to conservation. And the Vice President, Al Gore, was very interested in this emerging field of environmental security. He actually really wanted to shape this. And I recall one dinner at his residence at the observatory, not far from here, and he had invited Tad Homer Dixon, a Canadian scholar, as a speaker. And I see some heads nodding. Okay. So Homer Dixon was one of the early scholars in this field, and his work tried to establish a connection between resource degradation, scarcity, and conflict. Now, the cases were interesting, but not fully compelling to policymakers who were most concerned in this time really about denuclearizing former Soviet states and building partnerships with new allies. And that's really where Ken and Jeff's work comes in. At the time, you know, Jeff in particular at the Wilson Center was bringing together almost a surrogate interagency process with Secretary of State Warren Christopher, National Security Council heads, people from defense like myself and others, USAID, to really understand this field and build the field of environmental security. And you help develop a set of analytic tools about the benefits of environmental cooperation in an international context, this environmental peace building, if you will, that has helped to undergird a range, really a whole generation of policy-making efforts. Jeff referred to the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Program, which was founded in the early 1990s when the defense minister of Norway said to the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry at the time, that the most important thing that you can do in our defense relationship is to engage the Russians to address the threat of their decommissioned nuclear submarines that are sinking at bases close to our borders, our shared border between Norway and Russia, with threats of contamination. And from that, the Arctic Military Cooperation Program was born. And in those days, there was a lot of interest in the Russians in sort of learning new technologies, techniques, sharing information about contaminated sites. We jointly built a cask that carried liquid waste from decommissioned nuclear submarines, offloaded it at the shipyards, and then moved it inland to a safer storage post. Also, we conducted during these years in the 90s at DoD high-level environmental security conferences in every region of the world with each of the U.S. combatant commanders, Southcom, Pacific Command, EUCOM, Central Command, on the subjects of environmental cooperation most relevant in each region, and in a way that served to integrate civilian decision makers from environmental and finance ministries with their military counterparts. And these were highly relevant, and Jeff was involved in supporting, and Ken, I believe, in a number of them, with our 4 stars serving as sort of these uber diplomats around the world, able to bring together environment and foreign and defense ministries. And it produced a lot of good results in that era. And DoD we created a Defense Environmental International Cooperation Program. It still exists to this day. And I believe, Jeff, you actually were invited to speak at it when it met in Alaska last year in the Pacific Environmental Cooperation Forum. So these early efforts have continued to have legs, which I think is very important. And Ken's work has been utilized by diplomats at state to support hydro-diplomacy efforts and to forge new partnerships in regions around the world, from South and Central Asia to the Baltics, South Africa, and even along the U.S.-Mexico border. Their work has shown that building trust among local partners on natural resource matters, from water to waste, can help build the type of trust needed to tackle even more intractable matters. And one of the best examples today is that of EcoPeace Middle East, which has forged a partnership. We have one of the representatives here, a partnership to address the water and security issues that affect Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. It has become a core component of Mideast peacemaking and one of the few bright spots in resolving long-standing conflicts in the region. And we've been proud to welcome EcoPeace practitioners to the Wilson Center to highlight their work. So I know from my own personal experience that there are many still in the U.S. government today, many today working in the U.S. government who rely on your work to support their continuing efforts to advance hydro-diplomacy, transboundary peacemaking efforts, a range of environmental security efforts. And on behalf of myself and the many beneficiaries of your scholarship and your work, let me thank you for your extraordinary contributions.
Do we have roving mics? So if people would like to ask questions or make observations, please raise your hands. We'll take 3 or 4 and let the panel respond. Starting in the back there.
Thank you very much. Dr. Conca, you mentioned, excuse me, not enough attention was
Introduce
paid.
yourself too.
Oh, I'm sorry. So Steve Elliott, Executive Master Program here at American University. You mentioned there's not enough attention paid to institutions, means that governments, NGOs. I was wondering how involved multinational corporations are in peace building. For example, hydro-diplomacy, like a beverage company helping out, or are they viewed as global north, colonial corporations, and maybe not the best to work with global south countries? Thank you.
Joel?
Marina Jonas, EcoPeace, and actually an alumni of AU as well. So, one of the things that I really am looking forward to is also some of the more academic backup, not necessarily in terms of the compartmentalization of this is security policy, this is water policies, this is environmental, and so on, but really how do we reach across? Because what we're seeing, and particularly in the Middle East, is that the military starts understanding the security threats of not having the awareness of the environmental situation. It's the politicians that are the problem.
Hi, my name is Barbara Ween and I teach here. I would love to hear anything you might have come across from indigenous communities, from Native American communities or First Nation peoples that could guide us in peacemaking. Any really good models you may have seen. I was absolutely inspired and amazed at how many people came together around Standing Rock across so many communities, including veterans, to try and stop the pipelines and stop the pollution of the aquifer. I just wonder, in your wanderings and in all the thousands of case studies you have gathered across the years, if we can tap some of the wisdom of indigenous communities. I'm not trying to romanticize, but if you could comment on that, thank you.
Let's take one more there, and then we'll panel respond and continue.
Hi, my name is Chana. I'm actually interning at the Environmental Law Institute, and I'm from Kenyon College. But you mentioned Flint, Michigan, and the relationship between justice and peace building. And I was wondering if you thought that there was anything in the peace building movement that would sort of be tools or sort of resources or things that people could do in the domestic fight for environmental justice, and sort of the link between the two.
Maybe start at the end, Jeff, with you and Raj.
Well, I think I know Ken well enough to know which ones he wants to do, so this time I'll go first, right? Ken's going to tell you about the justice mechanisms, but I'll just make a larger point, which I think one of the weaknesses to date of this environmental peace building discussion, and in part it's because Ken and I study international things and we're not focused primarily on the United States, or it's the United States vis-a-vis the international system, is that we Kirk Emerson, so there's some fantastic people who focus on environmental conflict resolution methodologies and in the United States, and we don't talk enough. So that would be, if you're looking for senior theses, master's theses, PhD, that's ripe territory for putting those things together, where justice is part of that discussion. But even just those two, that exceptionalism that so often pervades political science departments, the Americanists and the comparativists and IRs don't talk. Well, that's a problem here too. For eco-peace, the challenge of the politicians versus the military. I think one might say that these are challenges that we're very familiar with here in the United States, as well as kind of depending, it ebbs and flows, of course. I think at a really fundamental level, talking across the different sectors, I think we are in universities in silos, as appropriators in silos, and ministries in silos. And I think part of our challenge is we're not very comfortable with complexity or defining success in multiple ways. And so part of the politicians' obsession with this rather than that, or funders' obsession with, no, I want a single indicator of success, is part of the problem in getting through to that. I think there's learning to be done in all sectors. But I think you point out that in a number of cases, the military doesn't have the luxury, in some sense, if they're responsible for understanding risk, to kind of, when ideological winds go one direction, to put your head in the sand on potential things just because it's not politically convenient. Now, there's lots of diversity within those different sectors as well.
So, just briefly try to hit all the points. So on multinationals, it's an enormous challenge. Most of the actual violence in the world around natural resources and environment is not interstate conflict. It's not countries marching out into battle over something, or upstream, downstream in a river basin. It's quite localized, right? It's land and water grabs, it's extractive industries, and so on and so forth. And often transnational investment is so enormously disruptive of local communities that becomes the main focal point for tension. That being said, it's critically important to engage that community in conversation. We're on the cusp of some major adaptation as a result of climate change. The amount of infrastructure that has to be rebuilt to make our societies flood resilient and energy conserving and so on, it's really quite daunting, the task that's ahead of us. And this landscape is going to look so dramatically different 30, 40 years from now than it does today. And private capital is going to be a significant portion of that. If you wanted to build a dam 30 years ago when you were a poor country, you'd go to the World Bank, they'd write you a check if they approved the project. The check would go to the finance minister. There'd be challenges of corruption at every step of the way. The dam would be built, and the revenues from the dam would be used to pay back the World Bank. Today, the World Bank is still funding dams, but they're underwriting insurance programs for a portfolio of 25 private sector investors, turbine manufacturers, construction companies, et cetera, to build that sort of project. And so it's a part of the landscape, it's a set of key actors that simply have to be engaged. On Marina's point, the idea that politicians are the problem is strangely resonant for me in this town at this moment. I'll make just maybe one observation. So there's Jeff and I and some other folks have worked with Adelphi Research in Germany. It's a consulting firm that does a lot of work for the German government, supporting their international environmental initiatives and so on. And they became very concerned that we had kind of depoliticized this space, and that was one of the reasons why the politicians were not engaging in this space. There was this sort of a technocratic premise on the part of many donor agencies that by doing water cooperation initiatives, say in shared river basins, you could expand the pie, so to speak, that the development would start to kick in and there'd be efficiency gains and so on, and that you could sort of leave the hard political questions out of it. And then the economic gains would sort of kick in and people would have a material incentive and so on. And that really hasn't taken root in very many of the world. I mean, you work in the Jordan. You should be answering this question, not me, right? Given the work that you all are doing in the Jordan River Valley. And I'll just turn it right around and point to the master plan, right? That you all have put together as a way that tries to, sort of start with the sort of premise that what we need is foundational political cooperation in this space in order to enable some of the things we have to do if we're going to be able to live together in the space. And so I think there's a certain kind of repoliticization of these issues, but in a way that can foster dialogue, not in a way that polarizes. That's critically essential. That's very, very difficult. I'm not an authority on indigenous people. I mean, it's an important question. Among the most marginalized communities, among the most frontline communities for the sort of violence that I was talking about earlier. I've always found the Arctic Circumpolar Conference to be a really interesting initiative. I come at this from one of the things that we try to think about is what forms of usable knowledge do people have and how can that be something that brings them together in dialogue and conversation. And that's a body that has tried to, not in a paternalistic way, take seriously local knowledge, community-based knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and also take serious science and put the two together and create new forms of understanding that are kind of hybridized versions of the two. And just the fact that that initiative has been able to sustain and try to do those sorts of things, to me, is a hopeful example. And then finally, on the great question about the sort of the domestic sphere and so on, and when you do a lot of work internationally and you see what's going on in your own country, sometimes you feel like you're just abdicating some of your own responsibility. I will say, I don't have a great answer, but two things I think are central. The first is a certain humility. When the UN Environment Program first tried to engage the new government in Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban in conversation, they were told, no thanks, we got it. We know what's going on here with our natural resources, and there's really no form of international assistance that they require. And that was a very surprising response for UNEP to get from many, they wouldn't get that from any of the other countries that they work with. And they stepped back and said, well, okay, and they got it, and they thought, well, this is really a place where we can be working, and we have some things that would be useful and so on. And so they re-engaged the Afghan government, and they said, there's a lot going on in this country that we can learn from, and we'd love to be able to work together with you side by side and learn from your experiences and so on. And really just kind of shifted the relationship in certain fundamental ways. And I think that kind of humility, when it's outsiders and local communities, it has to be sort of the first point. And the second thing is just do no harm. I mean, there's so much low-hanging fruit here in the sense of basic conflict sensitivity. For years, the U.S. Agency for International Development here in the United States produced conflict toolkits for their field operatives. So minerals in conflict, land in conflict. And it never looked at sort of peace and positive opportunities. And it didn't really sort of, I would say, sensitize staff in an effective sort of way just about the ability, the responsibility to work in this space in a way that does not create harm. And then 10 years later, actually, Jeff was very involved in this. They came back and they did sort of a new generation of those around the water tool. And I think it's a very, very powerful, actually very, very powerful guiding document for people who are going to go out in the field. It's about 40 pages long. And the first 20 pages are about all of the ways in which the project that you were doing can do violence in this space, can trigger conflict, can be part of the problem. And it's a sort of a, if you read that and you take it seriously, it's sort of a vow not to do harm in this space. And then the second 20 pages is saying be creative and be aware of ways in which cooperation can be facilitated, local ownership can be facilitated, the voice of local communities can be facilitated. And to me, I think, rather than having a magic technique, I'm not suggesting your question implied this, but rather than having a sort of a magic technique from afar that will be translatable across different scales, because it's so different. I think starting with that kind of a sensibility of the humility, conflict sensitivity, do no harm, and then a kind of an opportunistic approach to dialogue takes us very far. So that would be my starting point.
Okay, I'll speak as a practitioner. So on indigenous communities, when I was at DOD, the Native Americans, Native Alaskans serve in higher percentage in the United States military than just about any other demographic. And they approach their service with a sense of duty and honor, but also they're very aware of the ways in which military activity on tribal lands has at times been destructive and had left consequences from munitions to water contamination and the like. And I spent a good deal of time during my service with those in indigenous communities to try to respect and recover for the harm that had been done over the years. But I will also note that the leader, and you observed that at Standing Rock, the veterans were very active, right? Young veterans, this current generation of veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and the lead organizer was General Wes Clark's son, okay? General Wes Clark served in a number of four-star positions, both as head of NATO Supreme Allied Command was his last job, but before that he was head of Southern Command, and he and I worked together when I was in DOD. We did a Defense Environmental Conference for Southcom, and he was very directly involved. He was so proud to bring all those ministers together, but it was also in an era, as Ken alluded to, the kind of North-South conflict where one of the lead newspaper headlines out of that conference was from Brazil saying that the Americans are trying to invade the Amazon. So, but that's just an aside. But anyway, I think the Arctic as well is a place where there are Native Alaskan and indigenous communities across the Arctic that are now organized through either the Circumpolar Conference or as observed. They have actually specific status within the Arctic Council now. And there is also the whole movement of citizen science is very active in the Arctic and in other areas where you're in remote locations and you need observations, and because of technology and data science advances, those in the who live in the region are best able to collect and create that observational data that's so important for everything from climate change to to agriculture. On environmental justice, I think there's a lot that we've been talking about here in the international realm that I applied directly in dealing with environmental justice issues when I was at Defense. For example, many defense military bases are located in regions or locations where there are also environmental justice issues associated with either racial or economic inequities. And one of the keys I found to addressing that was to kind of be very open about the problems that have been created, and then create partnerships and stakeholders. I mean, I brought environmental organizations and other community organizations into the Pentagon, many of whom had never been invited into that building before. And just by creating that trust and openness, we were able to forge some new relationships. So I'd say that's also important. EPA at the time had a very active environmental justice program. I don't think that's the case today. On Marina's question about the military and you know, we used the military, particularly in the U.S., in Israel, certain countries, has a lot of credibility within the society. They're uniquely highly regarded institutions. And so the Military Advisory Board that we founded to address climate change as a national security issue now 10 years ago, and is very much sort of connected with this whole movement we're talking about here, has also uniquely been able to help give credibility to sort of climate change issues as a national security concern in a way that people who don't want to be seen as tree huggers can find ways to talk about it. But I'd say that model could also be useful in water security cooperation or sort of other areas of natural resources.
Before we take the next round of questions, I want to make two quick comments. One on the indigenous communities and indigenous systems. Many conflict-affected countries are characterized by extremely low capacity to project anything resembling authority outside of the capital. And so one of the approaches that you see in a lot of conflict-affected countries is the use of legal pluralism, where you acknowledge that there are traditional norms and institutions, and you provide a statutory framework that essentially allows that to operate, but you can appeal to the statutory system to protect things like women's rights or rights of minorities, things like that. But there is often an effort to build state legitimacy and build the rule of law by engaging with these indigenous systems. And then I'd like to follow on Sherry's comment about the kind of the linkages between peace building and environmental justice. And a lot of the thinking that most of the people that I know who work in this space on environmental peace building, we tend to focus on armed conflict and prevention of armed conflict, what happens during armed conflict, what happens after armed conflict. And I participated in a conference in Northern Europe last year on environmental peace building in Latin America. And everyone there was talking about mining disputes. There was what many would call social conflicts, like Standing Rock. And my first reaction internally was, that's not really the conflict I'm talking about. The next thing that I thought about was, well, what's different? And I don't think that we have really addressed this. So for people who are looking for research topics, the question of what's similar, what's different between the social conflict and the environmental justice, lack of fairness, structural inequities, structural violence, and then the more violent conflicts and armed conflict, and what are the tools that are applied in the violent conflict, armed conflict, peace-building context, and to what extent are those tools and strategies relevant or applicable in what might be called latent conflict or social conflict, and what could be done differently or what should be done differently. I think that sort of thinking has not been really developed well. That you have the people who work on these social conflicts and the people who work on the armed conflicts, and they haven't been talking as much as one would think. So with that, there's a question here, and then there and there. Okay.
Hi, my name is Samantha Hall. I'm a student at SIS. You briefly mentioned political sensitivities. Across your studies, what other sensitivities have you come across, or if there's any gaps that you're looking into? Thanks.
Todd Walters, International Peace Park Expeditions, and also a proud SIS alum. You guys focused necessarily on the sort of past 20 years and the evolution of this idea and the challenges that it faced initially and sort of how it overcame some of those challenges to kind of get where we are today. I'd like to ask you guys to look forward an additional 20 years and tell us what you see as some of the future challenges that the field will be facing, as well as what are some of the potential opportunities to overcome some of those foreseeable challenges. Thanks.
Paul Wapner, I'm here in the School of International Service. I just want to say very briefly about the book. I remember when the book came out, and I liked the context, Ken, that you provided, historical context where there was a lot of environmental security sort of emerging, and it was sort of like, oh my gosh, it's much worse than we thought, the environmental predicament. And I felt like your book was like a great exhale. It was like, oh wow, there's some actually optimistic news. My question is that in some ways, as I understood the work, that there was this notion that the environmental piece was kind of a technical piece. And it could have interventions in the security piece because it could kind of sneak in kind of a functionalist way, come in, and people could get together around these technical questions. But your work since then has certainly shown that it's much more than a technical issue, and that it can actually cause conflict and so forth. So I'm wondering, sort of, at the theoretical level, what's the mover here that brings these together? I mean, in the old school thinking, we would say, well, it could get in the door because we're really not talking about high politics. But now you've told us this is high politics. So how do we rethink the kind of engagement dynamic of these two issues?
Hi, I'm Laura Cooper Hall from the Population Reference Bureau. I have a question in terms of more international level policy and inclusion. So when we're talking about the UN level policy and how to make sure that these dynamics and integrated issues are being included, has this been brought up on the UNFCCC level, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change? And within that space, often action is driven by financing. So how might that be included, or has that been yet included in financial mechanisms like the GCF or the Geoff? And do you think these are relevant spaces to be using if they haven't yet been?
Okay. I'm going to address the question on what are the future challenges that Todd raised. And I think that the future challenge in this area is to be able to improve the next 20 years. We have sort of unprecedented risk now that we face with climate, particularly with climate risk, but other environmental degradation and water scarcity risk. But we also have unprecedented foresight. And so in many ways we have really a responsibility to prepare for the future. And that comes at the same time that we are, through big data, better data analytics, and technology and processing capability, better to improve our predictive capability. So we are, closing in on, we are being able to close the gap now between weather, reliable, 1 week weather prediction, and much longer term climate forecasting. Scientists call it seasonal to subseasonal, and that's sort of 2 weeks to 2 months is the subseasonal, and seasonal 2 months out to 12 months. And as we improve that predictive capability for everything from agriculture to fisheries to, just every industry is going to be affected by it. But we'll also be able to understand better disruptive weather and water events, which are occurring with more frequency in the climate era. So I think this is going to really just transform this whole field. Things are going to move much more rapidly. I think you know, the practitioners are gonna need to integrate the data analytics. I mean, that's kind of where I'm trying to go now at the sort of nexus of practice, theory and practice, and I have a project on this at the Wilson Center that works with a number of federal agencies that are at the forefront of doing this. And I think this, so to me, this is kind of the leading edge of where we're gonna go on that. And on engagement dynamics, I agree with you. You know, it's moved beyond sort of the tech, you know, we could just feed it in as a sort of way of partnering. But because now we've moved from the nuclear era into the climate era, and this is really one of the most existential challenges we face, it is really part of the most important security dynamic. And although we have our head in the sand a little bit right now in parts of the United States on this, it is shaping the way the world is turning and the threats that we're going to have to face in the future. And that's a good segue. I'll let Ken talk about the UN dynamics associated with that.
Sure. So, yeah, several points. So I'll take them sort of in here. So on sensitivities, in some sense, it's all about the sensitivities and understanding the sensitivities. And I think often around some of these arenas that we're talking about, very few people that are in that arena are primarily concerned about the environment and natural resources. It's something else. So it's all sensitivities. In the international sphere, for some of the work that I do, sovereignty is still a really, really big issue. There are too many countries that are too young and fought too hard too recently to be willing to cede authority over their natural resources. And many people in the privileged world and the environmental community tend to be dismissive of that because the environment ignores borders and so on. But people don't ignore borders, and for some people, borders are, you know, the foundation for them having some autonomy in their lives. So that's a sensitivity that is very, very important to acknowledge and to recognize. The use of unequal institutions. Right, the existing built landscape of institutions. We're not in an era of building new institutions to solve these problems. We tend to use the ones that we have, and so you know, the Security Council versus the General Assembly, a lot of those sorts of things. The conversation is a great sensitivity to what's the mandate, and that's not just a turf battle, and it's not just legalese. It's a real recognition that the power dynamics are very, very different in different institutions, and so it's very, very challenging to find an institutional setting. You can always make one up in an informal sense, but then it's hard to get traction. If you start working in formal institutions, that's a great sensitivity. There are lots of others. On Todd's question about looking forward, so a small, very interesting organization that I admire a lot is the Pacific Institute, Peter Glick's shop although it wasn't just Peter, of course, in Oakland, California. And they had a big global agenda, were interested in all these sorts of questions. And then they moved into a restored Victorian 3-story house in a very poor part of Oakland, West Oakland, because the city had done some renovating of some of these beautiful old houses and made them available to artists and nonprofits and so on. And they felt a certain responsibility to engage with the community if they were going to be in the center of the community. So they started a kind of a community sustainability envisioning program. And the first generation of that program was basically them reaching out to the community and saying, we have all this analytic expertise, and we know that West Oakland's not getting a fair deal from the city, from the county, from the state. And there's all sorts of ways that we can map this environmental justice and get it down on paper and so on. And they got kind of lukewarm reception. And so in the second generation of that work, they partnered in a more genuine way with a wide range of community groups, some of which were environmental, some of which were decidedly non-environmental, and they got more traction. Today, they're running workshops where activists are downloading desktop GIS software and doing their own analysis. That's the future, right? There's been some fascinating experiments with citizen science in the DRC, in the Mekong. So there's a lot of mining going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo that's implicated in conflict. There are all sorts of formal and informal transnational rules about sourcing conflict-free materials and so on. And there's now some very interesting software that you can have on your phone where you can upload to a database crowdsourced information about what's going on with those mines, and you quickly delete it from your phone because it might be risky to have it on your phone and so on. And that's now starting to be used in the Mekong to identify where construction crews are, or what the water levels are, or what kind of fish are not as abundant as they might have been in years past, and so on. And so there's this sort of explosion of open access to information, but difficulty vetting the quality. It's going to be, you know, I'm wary of just saying the world is flat, because I just don't want to use that phrase and go there. But there's ways in which just dealing with that much more creative but also kind of cacophonous space, that's going to be the future of this, because there's too many actors who just can't be kept out of the room permanently. And on Paul's question, I don't know. I will say, I think of like the Trojan horse kind of concept of this as the way that many people sort of try to use it. I know that UN Environment often is invited in to work in countries, and they don't go where they're not invited. They don't have a mandate to be working on the ground unless they're invited in by governments. And they will often present to the governments the technical expertise that they have as a way of beginning to engage in dialogue. And there's a lot of good work that can be done that way. And so they might come in and say, well, let's just do a rapid appraisal of the impact of the war on the environment. And then let's define some needs and try to match with the donors and others who might fund recovery efforts. And then let's start thinking about what kind of legal frameworks might be useful going forward, or what kind of bureaucratic capabilities might be going forward, or maybe we need to buy some desks and some computers for the Environment Ministry. Very basic stuff, very valuable stuff. And I've seen a lot of that at work to know that it's got great value. At the same time, that always butts up against a ceiling of the more contentious kinds of things that have to be engaged. And so there's power in that strategy, but there's also real limitations in that strategy. I don't have easy ideas. Sometimes it can't be the same organizations. I don't know if it's good cop, bad cop, or if it's a sort of a division of labor along the spectrum. But I'm torn, because on the one hand, I have seen the real value in very practical ways for lots of people of doing that sort of work. But it always peters out, and it's always limited if it's simply going to define the problem in technical terms and define the solutions in kind of narrowly functional terms.
These are fantastic questions. I think Ken addressed Samantha's really well, so for the sake of time, I'll jump to Todd's and would just amplify Sherry's point about kind of the future not necessarily looking like the past, and climate change being a primary dimension, where, as I mentioned in the talk, we need to find ways to integrate this. The same old saw, it's a problem we've had the last 20 years, we'll probably have in the future 20 years, but as Carl pointed out, moving beyond our overriding obsession with parsing out the contribution that these issues do or don't play in the onset of conflict, and understand there's so much more, particularly formal armed conflict, right? Just so much more. Wouldn't know that from the journals, wouldn't know that from a lot of where our colleagues spend time. Important to do it, but gosh, there's a whole lot more we could do. And then finally, and maybe it's because Alex Deegan's here, but it occurs to me that these issues that I don't think of bringing together, I'm seeing it at the Voinovich School. We have, on the one hand, environmental studies and public administration. We also have a $50 million investment fund on building tech-based companies as economic development in Appalachia, right? And we're moving into social enterprise, so that it's not just an economic bottom line, but a education, health, environment. How do we use the toolboxes of entrepreneurship and innovation, those business toolboxes, to solve these wider problems? So with Alex and Conservation X Lab taking on these really big questions with a different toolbox that move beyond, because as he said, conservation, ecology, what's your line? Ecology is a job of just documenting extinction. You know, kind of talk about depressing, right? So how are we gonna just really shift it? So I would love to see folks looking at, like, where we are working with partners in the Balkans. How do we bring a social enterprise approach to sustainable economic growth that they must have in order to find ways to move forward? That to me is, you know, one exciting direction that we should do some more of. Paul's on high politics, low politics. I think I've often had, well, for starters, I think both can be going on, both be interesting. It's often, folks will say, well, if it's not high politics, then why does it matter? And obviously some of this kind of technical illustrates it. I think, as Ken has suggested, finding ways where one can do the low politics with looking over the horizon so that those patterns of cooperation can, poli-sci speak, spill over into other areas. And I think we have some cases where there's evidence of that, whether it sticks, whether it's going to just stay local and is very particular to people in place is another question, but we should try. Finally, on UNFCCC, and I'd add another acronym, IPCC, to that. On IPCC, lamentably will report that the 6th assessment does not have its own chapter for these issues like the 5th did. 5th one, it was the first time human security and was an explicit focus. I think the governments are going to be upset when they figure that out, that they kind of left it to a couple academics who didn't see this as important and said, we're going to have 20 instead of 30 chapters, and so this issue is kind of fallen out. Not with a degree of intentionality, I think, but nevertheless. I don't think these topics are well integrated with financing, and I think that's a problem. I think it's a problem that will not go away unless we bang on doors more broadly, just to expand what is considered an appropriate climate response for financing. And we saw that again, IPCC, we looked at migration and adaptation in the context of climate change. Some of the most interesting stuff, the former winner of this award, John Barnett's work, is you have to totally reconceptualize what is a climate intervention to lower vulnerability and give greater agency to affected populations. You can't deal with the injustice that they're having to move and they'll be displaced, but you can facilitate their ability to have choice and have agency in that. So not a lot of great stuff to report, but again, a good area to focus going forward.
Just one final thought. I didn't answer the finance question, and I really want to pick up on something that Jeff said. So if you build a really large dam today, the best practice is considered to recognize that you can't anticipate all the problems that it will create and simply cut a check to the people who've been forced to move, often with no voice in the project and so on. And so the best practice is to create a fund and a mechanism by which if farmers, if the new morphology of the river causes farmers to lose their land, that money will actually be there and they won't be out of luck if there's some sort of downstream effects or long-term effects and so on and so forth. And I have very mixed feelings about that because on the one hand, on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I tell myself that that's really a great thing for the farmers. And on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I worry that those sorts of things are enabling, we're making a small problem smaller in a way that makes it possible to make the much larger problem, which is the way we think about infrastructure and that river and those people larger. And it's a kind of an enabling thing. And so on the one hand, it's critically important that UNFCCC, through loss and damage and some of the other provisions, get engaged in this. On the other hand, it's critically important that we watch very, very carefully that those forms of engagement, sometimes best practice isn't good enough, and that those engagements don't simply facilitate business as usual in a way where we really miss the larger opportunities.
With that, I would like to thank you all for sharing this day with Ken and Jeff, two very remarkable people in the field.
And a special thanks to Carl, who he will never say. Series would not exist without Carl. The award would not exist without Carl. The website, environmentalpeacebuilding.org, which has an enormous amount of material and a great email list, would not exist without Carl. A lot of things that wouldn't exist without Carl, so we really do appreciate it.